Hello and welcome. I'm Damian Wetzel, Director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program, and it's a pleasure to welcome you, to those of you who are just joining us, to this second annual symposium on culture in a changing America. Since 12 noon, this historic space has been hosting conversations and salons and performances, all built off of the energy of 1968, that event-changing year, which is still pushing us forward. For this final session, we are joined as our moderator by our Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, Tom Finkelpearl. And Tom, yes, thank you, Tom. And he'll be joined by three of our extraordinary cultural leaders, Thelma Golden, Virginia Johnson, and Sade Lythcott. Please, Tom.
Okay, greetings everybody. I'm Tom Finkelpearl, and we're going to hear from these three fantastic leaders in a minute. I was just thinking about 1968. I was 12 years old. I was living on the Vassar campus up in Poughkeepsie, and I remember that there was a sit-in, and the African-American students took Main Hall and demanded the formation of an African-American or Black Studies department. It was incredible energy in the air. The whole campus was in a kind of feverish thought about politics, and it feels like today, like the college campuses are today. But some amazing stuff was happening right down 50 miles south of that from Poughkeepsie, right in Harlem. And so we're going to hear stories about three organizations that were founded right around that time. And then we're going to sort of talk about the present and the future. But let's just get right into it. And Virginia, would you like to begin? Yes.
Thank you, Tom. So yeah, the 1960s, I wasn't 12, but the 1960s was really a point of change in this country, and we've all thought about that a lot. But the moment, actually, for Dance Theatre of Harlem was, of course, the assassination of Dr. King. Arthur Mitchell, who was our founder with Carl Shook, had a career with New York City Ballet. He was the first African American to be a permanent member of an American ballet company. So he had established himself in ballet and was very successful and very popular. He'd been asked by the U.S. government to go down to Brazil to start a ballet company to make that kind of international relationship a lot stronger. He was on his way to the airport on April 4th, 1968, when he had the news that Dr. King had been assassinated. And he said, what can I do? What can I do, a ballet dancer, to make a difference that the same way that Dr. King made a difference? And so he decided he would open a school. So he, that summer, opened a school. He was in the basement of a church, St. James Presbyterian Church, where Dorothy Maynard had Harlem School of the Arts. And he opened a school of classical ballet, not because he thought he was going to make other classical ballet dancers like himself, but he wanted to make a change in the lives of these young people. He wanted to give them the skills to have a better life. And he thought, classical ballet, you focus and discipline, and the most important, perseverance. Because all anybody says to you in classical ballet is, no, that's not good enough. But you have to keep going, you have to apply yourself. And so that was really the genesis for Dance Theatre of Harlem.
Wow, that was really concise. Thank you very much. Fantastic. What a role model in so many different ways.
Exactly.
Okay, so
yes.
Studio Museum in Harlem, same year, or actually the year before? Same year, okay.
Well, 1968, Studio Museum in Harlem is founded, but our story is somewhat different than Dance Theatre of Harlem, a national black theater, in that we didn't have a single or a duo of founders, but really founded by a group of people. But there were some significant figures in that. And the Studio Museum's founding came out of the desire to create a museum to present and preserve the work of black artists. It was responding both to the extraordinary exclusion of black artists from museums in this city and in this country, but also to what had already been the well-documented contributions of black artists in the world. So important to our founding were a group of incredible civic leaders, along with artists who felt the need for a museum. And the museum's first ideas, I often say our founders were incredible in the intentionality of our name, because in the name, studio, they wanted a museum that would focus on the support of artists through a studio program, which was started by the artist William T. Williams when we began. The word museum was in our name because though at that time, downtown New York, many artists and arts communities were rejecting the idea of the museum, the founders of the Studio Museum wanted to claim that, right? And claim that as an act of resistance to the exclusion. And Harlem, which they claimed because it's where we were, but it also was to speak to Harlem's past and the important role of the Harlem Renaissance, but also to project into the future that I believe that we are in now. We began in a sort of shared relationship to the National Black Theater in the same space on 125th Street and Fifth Avenue, to which the credit of really the definition of that space goes to Sade's mom, right, and thinking about what that space was, but with the idea that the museum, as a collecting institution, could write the history of Black artists, but more importantly, change the way in which American art, and really world art, was understood through the contributions of artists of African descent.
So Thelma mentioned studio, museum, and Harlem, but didn't mention the word in. But that, no, that's an interesting question. Why not
Or the.
of? Oh, the, yeah.
Or the.
Okay. But studio museum in Harlem
Exactly.
versus of Harlem. So I
We-
just want to ask that.
Well, you know, it's what I call, Tom, you know, the sort of prepositional problematic, because a lot of people think our name is the Studio Museum of Harlem, and actually, when we redesigned our word mark about 10 years ago, both prepositions came off, right? So what you see now is Studio Museum Harlem. You know, I say that we are in and of Harlem, right? Harlem is the geographical place where we are, and we claim that in terms of what that means for understanding us, but we are also of Harlem, right? We came out of the neighborhood, out of this particular moment in Harlem, because, you know, when we talk about 68, we can talk about its national implications, but 1968 was an incredibly historic, fertile moment in Harlem itself. And so the in and the of, we sort of straddle between them, claim them whenever. When people say Studio Museum of Harlem, I don't correct them. We take them both.
Awesome. So, Sade.
So I also was not 12 in 1968. In 1968, my mother, Dr. Barbara Ann Tier, founded the National Black Theater, also the importance of choosing a name. And though 1968 was this catalytic time, often kind of marked by the assassination of Dr. King, I think more to the motivation and kind of the idea of moving up to Harlem to form the National Black Theater was actually Malcolm X's assassination a few years before. And for that, that was the kind of birth of this transition from through civil rights really to the Black arts movement and really looking at Black liberation, which is the roots of what National Black Theater was founded on. So there was the issue of parity. There was the issue of seeing our stories told, which was underrepresented on any main stage, whether it was an American theater canon main stage or whether it was Black theater happening in downtown places, like when the NEC was founded. Really are the zeitgeist behind the National Black Theater in 1968 in Harlem was Black liberation. And so kind of marking this and kind of tracing this 1968, more impactful for us was the Harlem Riots of 1968, right? This idea that the Great Migration that has happened culminated in Harlem in the 20s, and that kind of fertile time, that if we wanted to do really righteous, brave, risk-taking work that dealt at the center of our liberation, we had to do it in our communities, for our people, from our people. And so when my mother moved from Chelsea to Harlem after the founding of NEC, Harlem was the only place that she could really do the experimental kind of laboratory work. And it was, to Thelma's point, a very fertile time. We started out in the same building, the same year. At the same time, there was this idea that there was not just a moment, but a movement happening, and Harlem was the place. And so 1968 for us was that. I would say that the founding company of the National Black Theater, my mom was very kind of precise, and if you knew Dr. Tier, she was precise, that she wanted to blow your mind with blackness. And you couldn't do that if people were observing you from a voyeuristic or zoo-like perspective. You had to be able to get dirty with it, right? And so she didn't believe in actors, and she didn't believe in Western theater, to be very honest. She created rituals, but she understood that people would digest them through the paradigm of theater. And so her actors weren't actors, she called them liberators. And then she enticed you and seduced you to come uptown, similar to the Harlem Renaissance, right? And that you weren't audience members, but you were untapped, unrealized perhaps, activists. And so if we could have a conversation between liberators and activists, what could happen? And so that's our founding story.
And just to elaborate on that a little bit, the sort of physical space was important and remains important.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that, the structure of the space if you go to the theater?
So in 1968, we were founded on the corner of 125th and 5th Avenue in a building that is probably around the age of the building we're sitting in. It was an old jewelry factory that all of our founders kind of retrofit for the programs that we were doing. And in 1983, the ground floor of our building is commercial real estate. There was a Kentucky Fried Chicken, was like a very popular Kentucky Fried Chicken on 125th and 5th, right next to a dry cleaner. And there was a grease fire in the Kentucky Fried Chicken that caught with the chemicals of the dry cleaner, and it exploded our South Tower. It was a 6-alarm fire. And the building was ashes. And it really, I'm telling that story because it gave us the opportunity to really plant roots in Harlem in a different kind of way. When my mother saw those ashes, she didn't see the end of the National Black Theater, she saw the phoenix. And so she said in that moment, this opportunity to buy the most famous address in the entire world and dedicate it to, an institution of Black culture, human transformation, and Black liberation, I'm gonna do it. People thought she was crazy, but this idea that it's the most famous address in the world is because it's 5th Avenue, and you can go anywhere, right? We're on Park Avenue, you know where you're at. You could go anywhere in the world and say 5th Avenue, and you knew New York, you knew opulence, and you could say 125th Street, and you were in the mecca of Black culture in the middle of Harlem. And so she wanted to buy the intersection of the both and rebuild a temple of liberation that she knew ownership and really, investing in a community that looked like her, that looked like us, that was programmed by us, would be the key, really the keystone to liberation. And as a result, we are still there. We still own that property, and as we're kind of talking about, we're all in this interesting 50 years later, right, half century later, because of the vision of our founders, we have the opportunity to kind of reimagine and redevelop and rebuild that corner. And so that's where we are now. We're in the beginning of a redevelopment project that will sustain the National Black Theater for generations to come and will really mark 125th Street and 5th Avenue, which has been renamed National Black Theater Way, as kind of this beacon of Black culture, human transformation, and liberation right there in the corridor of East and West Harlem.
Thank you. That's actually not what I was asking about.
You were asking, but I'll tell you later.
That was
yes.
very important.
Yes, I do.
No, I was actually talking about sort of just the structure of being in the round when you're actually in the theater.
Yeah.
You mean, because we have two theaters.
Yeah.
We have a black box theater and we have a theater in the round. I think just very quickly, because because I know we don't have so much time. One of the things about ritual, right? This idea of circle, this idea of breaking the fourth wall. We have 2 theater spaces within our building, a black box theater that we've retrofitted to be our main stage, and then we have this octagonal Temple of Liberation that really works with kind of sacred geometry and the ancestral myths of West Africa. And there we do, it's a flex space, but we do a lot of performances that are really based on kind of ritual and are based on breaking that fourth wall, because we think that community is one, right? There is no, you can't have community with stages and levels that don't include all of us. So we like people to lean into the discomfort of getting to know their neighbor. And so that's the literal space in which we occupy in.
Great, thank you. And then, so then you've actually then also answered the next question that I'm going to ask. So, okay, so in this room, actually earlier on today, there was a performance that related to the moment in 1968 where John Carlos and Jimmy Smith on the podium at the Olympics put up their fists. And there was, so it was a sort of reenactment, Star Spangled Banner was sung, et cetera. So there's this moment in 68 where that happened, and today we have Colin Kaepernick and taking the knee, and this sort of, again, there was Black Power and the Black Arts Movement, and now there's Black Lives Matter, and sort of, if you then jump ahead the 50 years, I just want to talk about that moment, today's moment for your organizations, and maybe you're also building a building, but what about that, the 50 years ahead, what's, you know, where much water is under the bridge?
Well, I know we're all probably thinking about this because we're having to look not just back at the historic moment, but about the history that our organizations have made in the last 50 years. So when I think about the visual arts and I see the presence of Black artists in many places all over, I know that has to do very much with the history of the Studio Museum, our founding intention, the idea that our founders had to create more space for Black artists. But I also think it's important to understand that while thinking about our organizations in terms of our formal founding and these physical spaces, there really were germs and ideas and processes and practices that were going on that led to, right? What has become who we are. And I think that's happening now, right? So that the resonance for me is the idea that what we're producing, right, is significant and really important, and it's seen today, but we're also planting seeds, just as our founders did in '68, for what would happen now. We're planting seeds now for what's going to happen in the space of Black culture.
Yeah, and if I may ask then, so also the choice the Studio Museum made now was to build a ground-up building. So they had a good facility in a building, but the idea was to totally recreate from scratch that ground-up.
Totally.
Yeah.
So in 1968, we were in the National Black Theater building. We moved out in 1979 before they had the terrible fire that left their building gone. We bought a building at 144 West 125th Street, which had been built in 1914 as the Kenwood office building. So it operated until the middle 60s as that. When we acquired in '79, moved in '81, making the lower level, the first floor and the second floor, kind of into public space for the museum, renting and using the rest of the building, the other 3 stories, for our activities. Fantastic building, amazing location, but an old building that really was beginning to suffer, right, from its age. So we made the decision that to think about, you know, not just the sort of physical needs of the Studio Museum in the future, but to really attach to, you know, this idea again, as we did in the founding moment of our possibility, required thinking about a completely new building and engage the architect, Sir David Adjaye, to kind of think about this with a brief that not only gave us amazing purpose-built spaces, but began to think about a building that looked at what it meant to resonate with Harlem, right? The brief I gave was to think of the experience of the street, of the stage, and of the sanctuary. He added to that the experience of the stoop, and our goal was to make a building that was site-specific, site-suggestive, site-significant, and site-sensitive. And so that's sort of where we are now, closed about a month ago to the public, and moving towards a construction process that will have us in a new building in the future. I'm, sitting next to the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs. I'm not going to predict a date that, I can't keep here. And of course, it must be said that this building is being made possible with incredible generosity from many forms. But I want to particularly thank Commissioner Finkelpearl.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no, hold on. This is your money.
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you. I thanked all of them, but I'm thanking you.
It's taxpayer money. It's not my money. Okay. So, Virginia, you've had a little bit more sense of the whole continuity, having been around there and dancing from early time, and actually sort of rebuilt and so a healthy organization now. So I just wanted to say, how do you see that trajectory, the present and the future for Dance Theatre?
Sure. So, I am a founding member. I did join Dance Theatre of Harlem in 1969. And, one of the things that I didn't mention as I was giving the very brief answers, so the idea for Dance Theatre of Harlem was to transform the lives of young people in Harlem. But Arthur Mitchell also had another goal that was as big and as important as what might ballet look like if it was inclusive? If it was done by people who had something to bring to it that had not been brought before. So right then, in the early days of 1968, 1969, Arthur Mitchell brought together a group of people who had been told, no, you don't belong here. No, this is not for you. And I was one of those people. It was an extraordinary opportunity to take the training that I'd had for my whole life and be able to use it moving forward. And what Dance Theatre of Harlem did was to say, this is what ballet might be. And through those years, those early years of Dance Theatre of Harlem, when we would be on tour and people would say, are you the Harlem Globetrotters? Because nobody could imagine that there would be a ballet company made up of people who looked like this. And people would come to the theater expecting to see us popping our fingers and see us rise on the tips of our toes. Was an extraordinary experience for them to have their minds opened. And that's very much what Dance Theatre of Harlem was about for those first 40 years and continues to be. Because what really is the idea of this company, this art form, it's very much what you're doing and what you're doing. Our voice in this form has value, is valid, and is imperative. That we have the chance to open up something that had been incredibly narrowly defined and say, what is possible if somebody brings you an active imagination within that art form? What Dance Theatre of Harlem did over those 40 years, 49 years now, is to say, yes, we're taking an art form that has been defined in a particular way and saying, by inserting new voices, new bodies, new energy to it, this is what's possible. The next step for us to see is what happens when we actually have people who are creating works. One of the things that Dance Theatre of Harlem is doing right now is we have an initiative called Women Who Move Us. And it really is very much about creating opportunities for women of color or women to create works, to have a voice in this art form. Because for such a long time, it has been kind of a traditional thing when you look at these guys up here and you think, okay, these are the people who are making the world work. So what happens when these people make the world work? It's very much about giving that opportunity. This art form doesn't belong to one culture. It is about elevation. It is about the spirit. It is very much about an organized elevation, and there are rules, there's a form to it, but it doesn't mean that it has to be done only in the way that it's been done in the past. It really is about saying, what is the value of ballet in the 21st century? And to me, the only value it has is that it is speaking to the 21st century of the 21st century. And this is the goal. This is what we're moving towards as we create and recreate this company.
So I have a question. You're not supposed to ask questions you don't know the answer to. There's a legendary trip to Russia Were you on that trip?
I was. It was an amazing
man.
experience.
Okay, so we have to hear a little bit about this. And then I have one more question, and we're almost finished. But so I heard, I mean, just from reading about it, it just sounded like an incredibly exhilarating moment. But just could you just say a couple of words about that? And what year was this?
This was 1988. This was the end of the Soviet Union. So it was a period of transition in Russia as well. Arthur Mitchell had been to Russia with New York City Ballet in the 1960s, or maybe it was the 70s, but much earlier. And there were hordes of people who remembered Arthur Mitchell and were waiting to see his company when we got there. We performed in the Palais de Congrès, which was 3,000 seats, and it would just disappear into the darkness. There were so many people. And these people were interested in seeing their art form, because the Russians felt that ballet belonged to them, done by these exotic people. And so there was a sense of skepticism, but of deep anticipation. And the response that the company got in Russia knocked your socks off. They fell in love with anything that we did. Now, first they would say, "Niet classique," because it wasn't the way it looked, the way they were used for it to look. But they saw the truth of it, and they were so thrilled by it.
And so that, I was just thinking of the, you know, you have a form where you go on tour. You know, museums, shows go around, theater can go around. But, okay, so I have one more question, because I know we're running out of time. In 1968, you know, we were talking about, there was a book called Mounting Frustrations, which is about sort of the black art movement and how there was a moment in which there were some African American shows at the Whitney and the Modern, and there was Harlem on My Mind, which we won't go into. But so then, the white power structure said, just pushed it aside, and sort of was a moment that left, and there was a long period of a drought, let's say, in terms of white institutions showing black artists, et cetera. So two questions are, you know, how is that in a way relevant to organizations which are founded by and run by African Americans, A, and B, how do we make sure that whatever, that there's a sustainability into the future? And I think you're all doing that in your organizations. But not to allow us, the world, to slip back, in a way, into the past, which is like what 68 was a certain moment. Your organizations continue to flourish. I don't know, that's a kind of rambling question, but if any of you would like to take a stab at what I think I'm trying to ask. That was really badly stated. Let me try over. Just, do you think that there are ways that the lessons of 68 and the great things that happened in 68, 50 years later, can propel us into a, you know, a great future as well?
I mean, yes, absolutely. And what I think is, you know, not enough is said about the moments when the spotlight is not on you, when the world is not prepared for your sacrifice. And I think the period of time that you're talking about that isn't kind of highlighted by 1968 or, you know, all of the protests that are happening now is this ancestral presence of perseverance and faith. So for us, we never diminished because we always kept feeding our community, and our community kept feeding us. But it is true, we are in a different period of time, and there is a different platform and another spotlight on us. And I think the truth of the matter is, so many of these moments are moments or movements, but what our founders did in 1968 were plant roots. And I think that's what the lesson to learn, is that, you know, the Harlem Renaissance was really about the artist, the writer, the dancer, the playwright. But our founders saw the value in ownership. And when you build an institution, you don't have the luxury, really, of kind of moving on so quickly. And so I would just say that sustainability is our key focus. Secession is our key focus. We are here because of our community, but also because our founders planted roots and decided to invest in a community and in a people and in a vision. And so we get the privilege of building on that. And I think that's where the sustainability comes in. There is no one playwright, there is no one director that we're investing in. We continue to reinvest in the community, and ownership and entrepreneurship is a mantra that we teach our artists, that we teach anyone that comes through the door, that you are not just your practice, but you are the way that you plant roots so that your practice can grow and feed other people.
Beautiful, thank you.
I think that the work is ongoing. It's a progression. Thelma said it very beautifully because of the work of Studio Museum. Artists of color are seen in many places, are recognized, are very much a part of the conversation. And that is actually what the future is about. That is what we're doing. We are not separate over here making our things for each other and ourselves, but to understand what American culture is and the voices and the influences and the projections that are possible when we share our work, our common history, and our uncommon history, our uncommon traditions and our common traditions to make an American culture. I think that we're at a point in time right now where we are beginning to understand that, yes, of course, we have to have the sense of great pride and responsibility to our heritage, but it is a linked heritage, and we need to make sure that we're actually making that our future as well.
And I think, to just add to what my fellow beloved colleagues have said, is that I think we also, while we are making and our institutions are invested in this wider conversation, I think understanding the power of institutional autonomy is something that the 50 years have given us. Because yes, when the light is no longer shining, when there's no longer an agenda that privileges sort of what we are about, our autonomy allows us to continue to define. And I also think that understanding sort of the principle of agency institutionally. I think our institutions have been about equity and thinking about what it means, as Virginia just said, to see through a wider lens. And then I also think what it means for us to think about the future is to maintain what I think has always been among multicultural organizations, among Harlem organizations, an incredible, generous sense of advocacy. Right? The ways in which we see our institutional lives as caring for those artist communities, those communities of producers, the communities of our audiences consistently. Not during 1 month, not during one particular project, not as a result of one funding stream, but all the time. And that really at mission is the work. And when that happens, that's how we ensure a bit of the sense that we don't lose the work that's been done, and we also provide more space for more work to be done in the future.
Beautiful. I should just leave it at that because we only have 3 minutes. But no, I was just struck by the idea that sort of the Harlem Renaissance is, well known as an incredible flowering of creativity, but I guess it wasn't institution building, right? That the next line, the next moment, this 1968 moment was the moment where people said, we have to make this, and this is, right? Right, okay, yeah.
Well, we had to, I think that the Harlem Renaissance envisioned institutions, certainly, but it did not engage in what might be how we think about that today. So I don't think any of our institutions would exist if we didn't have that kind of, the psychological space that the Harlem Renaissance created that really believed in this kind of incredible projection of what Blackness looked like through the arts and what our creativity meant in the world. But I do think that the creation of these physical spaces were important in the 60s, especially at a moment when the community, from a real estate perspective, was not valued. Right? That the fact is that these were cultural leaders and artists who were valuing Harlem in that moment. It's easy. Look, everyone wants to be in Harlem today, right? And open their arts institution. But in 1960, But, I have to say,
True.
50 years ago, right? For those who really said, we are going to be here and to grow with this community, support this community, be of this community as it begins to see itself again in the widest possibility. That was the radical gesture of that moment.
And I would just, because Thelma's always brilliant, and I would say the privilege that we get to be, is that in the same way the Harlem Renaissance continued to bury seeds and plant seeds and allowed 68 to happen, we're in this really catalytic, dynamic time. And when we think about our assets, nothing is more exciting than being able to find, create, plant, and nurture the seeds for the next generation so that someone will sit in these seats in 50 years from now and maybe talk about, 2018 and how that moment is possible because of this ancestral tracking and lineage and the migration of culture that continues. And so that is the privilege, really, of what it is we get to do every single day.
So I would say, and I wonder if the rest of you agree, this has been the most optimistic moment of my week, right? And so to hear this, thank you so much. So we're gonna, and I'd like to introduce George Stonefish, who's going to lead us out of the room.
I am a landowner. We are basically the landlords or the caretakers of the land that you now stand on. We have had it taken away from us, and they have misplaced us and spread us to the four winds. However, we're still here. And I want to tell the honorary people here that I really, really appreciate the fact that they took it upon themselves to bring in a member of the Lenape Nation to first of all open up today's doings, and that was me. And we sang an honoring song for everybody here to welcome you all and to bring all this knowledge together. And now they have asked me to end tonight's doings and to send you all on your way. And I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do that with a song that's called the AIM Song. Now, this song was written during the takeover of Wounded Knee in 1973 in the hamlet of Wounded Knee. Now, what I want you all to do when I sing this song is I want you to experience it from a Native American point of view. So I want all of you to close your eyes, and when I sing it, I want you to imagine in your mind 100,000 rounds of ammunition being fired over your head. Because this is what the U.S. Marshals, the FBI, the goon squad of the Oglawas did during the 73 days of the occupation of Wounded Knee. They fired up to 100,000 rounds into the camp to try to displace us. And even the Joint Chiefs of Staff were recommending to President Nixon that he bring in the 84th Airborne to remove us. But he refused to do it, and instead sent in negotiators and tried to resolve this peacefully. But in the meantime, we had to deal with the firefights every night, especially after we started to sing this song. Because this song would reverberate through the foothills of the Oglala Nation and through the foothills of the Wounded Knee settlement. And it used to scare the piss out of the marshals and FBI. So their only response was to resort to violence and to engage in a firefight that would be unbelievable, where the sky was lit up with tracers. So please, close your eyes. this in mind. The problems that happened during Wounded Knee about land, resources, and so forth are still going on with the pipelines that are being run through our and underneath our land. And it's a continuing fight that we've taken since then to our breast and foremost. We are willing to continue to try to prevent this monster in the White House from taking our land, destroying our aquifers, and totally destroying our environment, because it affects us all. And with that, I want to bid you a good night and have a safe journey home. Give some of this.